So this is the start of a new series, and this is going to be how to tune. Now in this series, we're going to talk about a lot of different tuning software products. I have some personal preferences, but really they all do the job pretty much the same. So find whatever you're comfortable with, get used to it, figure out where everything's located at, all the ins and outs of it, and you're going to be just fine during this process. How to tune, how to adjust the fuel and spark tables to get what you want out of the engine. We'll talk about boosted and NA setups. We'll certainly talk about how to get the most out of it safely and what are all the other things that are affected when you start increasing horsepower and torque levels. But before we really jump deep into all of those types of processes, we really need to define what we're doing and what's actually we're going to be using here. And that's what this video is today. We're going to talk about all of the sensors that are used. We're going to define each one of them. We'll talk about how they match up together and how changing one value in, for example, a fuel table will affect other sensors and how it reads and how the system reacts when you make those changes. We'll also talk about some tuning theories in this video. I want to talk to you about the two most popular ones. Now, one is what I use exclusively. The other one is not a bad process, but it really has some strong limitations, even though there's some pretty strong supporters of that type of style. So we'll talk about both of those. So let's talk about the two most commonly used strategies in tuning. That is AlphaN and speed density. Now, there's some pretty significant differences between the two. We'll talk about each one individually, and you'll hopefully see, but when I'm done explaining all this, what the difference is between the two and why one is really much better than the other. So what is AlphaN tuning? Well, AlphaN is a strategy that uses input from the throttle position sensor and engine RPM to set the fuel curve. It's the only sensor used in this strategy, which you'll see later on how limiting that is. But AlphaN seems to work best at wide open throttle, but really not much else when you start throwing all the other variables in there like load and air density and all that. So AlphaN, because of that, works really well in low vacuum situations. Hammer the throttle, wide open throttle, high RPM, high load, but low vacuum. It doesn't do really well when you transition out of that because it doesn't know how to adjust fuel very well. So if you look at it this way, an engine's fuel requirements are directly related to load and the RPM more than they are on that throttle position sensor. You can have throttle position sensor open 30%, but it depends really kind of how much on the load and how dense the fuel and air mixture is to tell the engine how much fuel to give it. So it really doesn't take any of that into consideration. It's just where's the throttle position sensor and how much RPM, it'll tell how much fuel to give it. So if you're going up a hill or you're towing, even if you're going downhill, whatever, it really doesn't help adjust very well in AlphaN. Temperature is also the biggest factor that AlphaN doesn't take into consideration at all. And temperature is very, very important when you're talking about the density of the fuel and air. So the hotter an engine gets, the denser or less dense it becomes. It doesn't adjust fuel based on temperature. And we'll talk about that here in just a quick minute. But big downfall to AlphaN tuning. So really works really well at wide open throttle, gives it the right amount of fuel based on the RPM and low vacuum and all that, but boy, it doesn't do very well with all that. So it's really the least efficient way to tune. Some guys will do AlphaN tuning because, hey, that's all they're at. A drag strip or a standing mile type of car, whatever. It probably works really well in that situation. But if you're doing a street car or even a autocross car, road race type car or whatever, you need to be able to work with fuel strategies that work in a lot of different types of varying load and density of air. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute, but that's AlphaN. Like I said, it's really not the best way to tune. Now let's talk about speed density tuning. So this is a fuel strategy that calculates the amount of air entering into the engine by volume and density and the speed at which the engine's running, or RPM, and monitoring the MAP or the manifold absolute pressure sensor and the air intake temperature sensor to calculate the amount of air entering the engine, so it knows how much fuel to give based on all of those sensors. Because of that, speed density is by far a way better strategy for tuning, because the air entering the engine is calculated based on how dense it is, and that's what the MAP sensor does really well. We'll talk about that here in a minute when we talk about the definitions, but the MAP sensor tells the ECU, the pressure or the vacuum, and that tells the engine or the ECU how much load the engine's seeing, and that way you can adjust the amount of fuel that it gives based on that load. Same goes with temperature sensor. The air temp and the coolant temperature sensors let the ECU see what the effect is on how much fuel and air is going into the engine. So if it's not giving it enough fuel, the temperature tends to creep up. It can give it a little bit more fuel. The load tends to creep up. It can add a little bit more fuel. The temperature sensor will tell the engine if that air-fuel mixture ratio is right. And the coolant temperature sensors there determine how much fuel is needed at startup based on the temperature of coolant, so how hot it is. So if it's cold and it ran for a couple hours or days or whatever, you'll get a little bit different amount of fuel dumped in there, whether or not, or like when it's hot, when the engine's been maybe shut off for 10 minutes at its operating temperature, whatever, the startup fuel is a little bit different. So for sure, speed density just takes in all those sensor information and lets the computer really base how much fuel is going to give it to it based on the load and how dense it is, the RPM, the temperature of that air, entering the engine, and how it's affecting how it's being delivered. So speed density is by far the best way of tuning, because it takes in all of the information that you're getting from the other sensors. Where AlphaN, it's just throttle position sensor and the engine RPM, and that's it. So for sure, most people will speed density tune everything when it comes to drivability, drag racing, autocross, whatever it is. You'll hear a lot of people talk about speed density, and that's why it's a better fuel strategy than AlphaN. So now that we understand what the two tuning strategies are and why speed density is way better than AlphaN, let's talk about the definitions of all those sensors and computer and everything else, so we kind of know what they do and how it all works together. So the ECU, this is the engine control unit. So this is basically the computer. It takes all that information from all those sensors, dumps it into the system, and determines how much fuel and spark is needed based on all that information that it's getting. They also can be called a PCM or a powertrain control module. Just depends on how many other computers are kind of tagged along with it, whether it's a body control module, a transmission control module, whatever. The PCM is just another way of describing it based on what other computers are in the system. But basically, it's just the computer that controls the engine, and we generically label it as the ECU or the computer. So let's talk about the MAP sensor, the manifold absolute pressure sensor. And it's where it sounds like it's located in the intake manifold. So the computer reads this sensor to really determine how much horsepower, how much power the engine's making, and really to determine if the right amount of fuel is being delivered based on the information that it's giving it. So really, as the engine transitions into more air, going through the throttle body, whether it's at wide open throttle, part throttle, whatever, this sensor really is also used to determine if the right amount of spark is being delivered, based on the information that's in the spark tables that are in the computer. We'll talk about that here down the road as well. But the MAP sensor really, really provides two very important pieces of data back to the ECU. How much load is on the engine and how dense the air is going into it. So To understand all of that, we really need to talk about what the word absolute means when it's talking about manifold absolute pressure. Absolute just means it is all of the pressure. And what do I mean by that? So inside the engine, you have pressure that's created from the air charge coming in, the boost, whether it's under boost and you're adding more pounds of psi to the air pressure coming in. It also takes into consideration the pressure that is naturally occurring everywhere. If you're just standing around outside, sitting in a car, whatever, there's barometric pressure, which I'm sure you've heard talking about weather, that's at 14.7 psi. That is just naturally the amount of pressure that our body feels everywhere. So if you look at like a vacuum gauge, for example, it doesn't read 14.7 psi when you pop it out of a box or whatever. It's zeroed out, so it takes into consideration that 14.7 psi. The map sensor also reads that pressure. It's constantly reading all of the pressure. So we need to understand that when we talk about manifold absolute pressure sensors, because it reads everything. It takes into consideration the atmospheric pressure and the pressure that's being generated by the air charge coming into the engine. So very, very important to understand that factor, especially when we talk about different map sensors based on boost and how many pressures that it'll read. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute too. I'll explain the map sensors. So you've got a 1 bar map sensor, a 2 bar, 3 bar. I think they go all the way up to 5 bar. I'm not sure, but those are the 3 most common ones anyway. So a 1 bar map sensor is typically used on naturally aspirated engine, and it reads 1 atmosphere. Doesn't need to read any more than that. There's not a lot of boost or any boost going through the engine. 1 bar map sensor is fine. That's typically what's on almost every stock engine out there. A 2 bar map sensor will read up to 2 atmospheric pressures. So you have the 14.7, which is what we're feeling here today. Add another 14.7 onto that, you get 29.4. But effectively, the map sensor is only reading the 1 atmospheric pressure because it ignores the first one. So if you're running a turbocharger or supercharger up to 10 pounds of boost, you'll use a 2 bar map sensor because it is perfectly capable of reading within that range. A 3 bar map sensor, which can measure up to 44.1 psi, will read up to 3 pressures, sensors, or 3 atmospheres. And because it only reads the first, or the first one that doesn't read, it only reads the second 2, then it's 29.4. So if you're going to run 20 pounds of boost, you can't run a 2 bar because it only reads 14.7. So you run a 3 bar map sensor that reads up to 29.4 psi, and boom, you're good to go. So that's what people are referring to when they talk about a 1 bar, 2 bar, 3 bar map sensor, is just the measurement of the atmospheres that is measuring based on that 14.7 psi. The first 14.7 isn't counted. So 1 bar, nothing. 2 bar, that 14.7. 3 bar is 29.4. So I hope that explains it fairly simply, but there again, it gets a little complicated when you start talking about these things without understanding what that first atmospheric pressure is. So let's talk about the idle air control valve. This is usually typically right in the throttle body. It controls how far or open or closed the throttle blade is, and that's what it does. It's there to regulate the idle speed depending on load, temperature, all those things. So typically when these are malfunctioning, you'll get an irregular idle speed. Sometimes it'll surge, it'll go high or low idle. Sometimes I've even seen them where it'll stall the vehicle, whatever, but the IAC is there really just to control the idle speed or to regulate the idle speed. Now, I've mentioned the throttle position sensor a couple of times. That TPS that we talked about in AlphaN, that's exactly what it is. It's a throttle position sensor. It's typically located in the throttle body or sometimes at the gas pedal to know how far open or where the throttle position is based on what the throttle body is, how far open it is. So it just monitors that movement of the throttle blade or the gas pedal to command how much fuel is going to be delivered to match the airflow, the engine RPM, and all that. So when you step on the gas and the blade is opened up by the throttle body, you're just allowing more air into the engine. Well, that TPS sensor tells the computer how much air is coming in and how much fuel to supply based on, how much air is coming into the engine, and the injectors will match that fuel supply to the engine. Throttle position sensor is very, very important. Obviously, AlphaN relies solely on that. When you're talking about speed density tuning, the TPS sensor is also very important because it just lets us know how much air we're going to let into the engine. Now let's talk about the air temperature sensor. Commonly, the IAT, intake air temperature sensor, or sometimes it can be called just an ATS, an air temperature sensor. It's located in the intake. Before the throttle body, it's typically usually closer to the air filter. The IAT can kind of be integrated in with the mass airflow sensor. We'll talk about that here in just a quick minute, but the sensor just tells what the temperature of the air is coming in. That'll help tell the computer how dense the air is coming in. The hotter it is, different density, the cooler it is. So if you've heard people talk about, at a drag strip, if it's hot during the day, cars will typically run slower than when it's cooler at night. Well, that's what we're measuring. The air intake temperature sensor will help determine what the temperature of that air is coming into the engine. Like I said, typically very close to the air filter. Now let's talk about the mass airflow sensor, or MAF. Usually, like I said, located, between the air filter and the throttle body. Like I said, sometimes and a lot of times they'll integrate the air intake temperature sensor right in with it. But the computer uses the information from the MAF and from the throttle position sensor to adjust how much fuel is needed based on how much air is incoming into the engine. So if throttle position sensor is open to certain, the TPS is open a certain percentage, and the speed that the mass airflow sensor is reading, the computer determines how much fuel to give the engine based on those two sensors. So typically, when a MAF goes bad, a lot of times maybe you've heard, that an oil type filter like a K&N or an Air Raid or one of those where it's a dry filter where you spray the oil on it to help filter the air. That's what they're talking about when those get corrupted. It doesn't really happen nearly as frequently. You really have to over oil a filter for this to happen, but you'll get a rough idle. Sometimes the engine will stall, not run right. That's usually a good indication that the mass air flow sensor is bad. But all as we're measuring here is just how much air we're jamming into the engine and how much air is incoming into the engine. Now, I made mention how important temperature sensors are in a speed density tuning. Well, a coolant temperature sensor is also very, very important in this system. And I mentioned it a little while ago, but the computer monitors the temperature of the engine to help determine what the effect of the fuel is that they're letting into the engine or letting through the injector. So typically the coolant temperature sensor is located intake manifold, cylinder heads. Just really depends on where the OE decide to put this, but that sensor that's all it's there for. It's just reading the coolant temperature and determines whether or not you're at the right engine operating temperature. So let's say it's on a factory ECU and GM says 210 degrees is where we want the engine to operate properly. When it gets to that temperature, the computer goes into what we call closed loop, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute as well. But the temperature sensor becomes very important because open loop and closed loop really helps to tell you what the engine's doing with the fuel and air the air that's coming in, how much fuel it needs to add to it. So we'll talk about open and closed here in just a minute as well. But temperature sensor, very, very important. Again, to go back to the AlphaN or speed density uses this sensor. It's very, very important in that AlphaN doesn't take this into consideration at all. So very, very key piece of data coming out of this sensor. So let's talk about AFR really quickly. That's a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. You know, people talk about AFR. What's your AFR? What's the AFR reading at your O2 sensor, whatever. Another very important piece of information to understand, air-fuel ratio really just tells you if the engine's running rich or if it's running lean. When we talk about AFR, 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel, or an AFR of 14.7 to 1, that is what's typically called the stoichiometric ratio. Probably heard that word before, stoichiometric. That's all it's measuring is how many parts of air, how many parts of fuel. Now that doesn't mean at perfect stoichiometric ratio that you're building the most power. Typically, you build more power at about 12 parts of 12 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. That's typically where max power is achieved. 14.7 is typically really good at, for light, idle, light throttle. It's just the most efficient mixture of air possible. And it's very hard to get there. And most people don't even really care where they're at, but it's just more of a, like I said, the perfect mixture. But typically when we talk about power, we're looking at a 12 to 1 AFR. That's typically where I tune to. Most people will tune to, to really measure if you're making the most power. If you're looking at a dyno chart and you're at 6,000 RPM, 6,500 RPM, and you are closer to that 14.7 to 1, people will typically add more fuel to it to get to the 12 to 1 so you can build more power. You got more air coming in, more speed of that air coming in. You're trying to get rid of it as quick as possible. More fuel with the air helps you build more power. So AFR is certainly a very, very important number. And as we talk about the tuning process down the road, we'll talk about AFR quite a bit because it'll help us determine whether or not we're making the most power. So now let's talk about that O2 sensor, because that sensor is located in the exhaust and it reads that amount of fuel and air mixture that's left over. Specifically, it measures how much oxygen is left over from what happens in the cylinder when the fuel air mixture is burned. The O2 sensor will tell us how much air is left over. So when we talk about measuring AFR, it's the O2 sensor that is reading that back to the computer. So if it's at that 14.7 to 1, that just means that you got the optimal amount of fuel and air entering the engine. It's being burned completely. You're dumping just exhaust out the back. And there again, we're at that stoichiometric ratio or measurement. So that O2 sensor is very important to us because it will tell us what that AFR ratio is. That's where it's measured from. So like I mentioned before, if we're going to build power, and that's what our key concern is, we'll want that AFR ratio that the O2 sensor is rating at about 12 parts to 1. 12 parts of air, 1 part of fuel. Now let's talk about a couple of different types of O2 sensors. You've got a narrowband O2, and you've probably heard people talking about a wideband O2 or a WbO2. The narrowband O2 sensor is typically used in emission-controlled vehicles. They're pretty set. They know what they want to read. They're just there to read that information coming out of it. doesn't really need anything else. A wideband O2 just reads a little bit more information, and that type of O2 sensor helps the computer calibrate or find what the most best fuel-air ratio is, depending on how much load and the demand is at the time. So wideband O2 is also really good in, for data logging, if you're trying to do some diagnostic work. But just the amount of data that the wideband O2 reads is much greater than the narrowband O2. So typically almost all of the time when we're talking about a performance application, it'll almost always have a wideband O2 sensor in it. Now, I made mention earlier about closed loop and open loop. And this is important to understand because it'll tell you what loop the computer is in depending on what the O2 sensor is reading it and giving back to the computer, temperature sensors are reading to give back to it. So open loop just simply means that the computer is looking at the pre-programmed tables that we'll put into the computer to tell the engine how to run until the O2 sensor and the temperature sensor are warmed up and ready to read in the O2 sensor the exhaust temperature, the exhaust properly, and the temperature sensor has got the right parameters for the engine temperature. So O2 sensors have to warm up. It's part of their process that when the engine is warmed up completely, the O2 sensor is warmed up completely, it'll properly read that AFR that the exhaust is giving us. So once that sensor is properly reading and it's completely warmed up, temperature sensor, you go into closed loop, which means that the engine's at all its operating temperatures, the engine's warmed up where it needs to be, and now the computer can start to read all of the sensors and adjust the fuel-air ratio based on what the sensors are telling it. So open loop just means it's reading the tables that we'll throw into the computer to operate the engine. Once temperatures are up, the O2 sensor's warmed up and reading what it needs to, then it goes to closed loop, and this is where we start to make our money when we talk about building a lot of powers at closed loop. Now, between the two fuel strategies, the AlphaN, the speed density, all the definitions that I gave you there for the engine control unit, the IAC, map sensor, MAF sensor, throttle position sensor, all of those key pieces of information, that's all of really the detail that we're going to really use when we start tuning an engine to get the right AFR to build the right power that we're looking for. So again, I'll keep going back to the AlphaN and the speed density. This is why the speed density is so much better than that AlphaN strategy, because all these sensors come into play in a speed density setup. AlphaN, if you remember, just reads throttle position sensor. So very important to get the right AFR so we can start tuning the engine to build us the power we want. And if the AFR is not correct, then we'll know that we either need to take away or add more fuel into the engine to get to the power that we want. And then to go back to all those other little details, why the map sensor is so important, and we've got multiple, map sensors depending on how much boost or how much atmospheres we're trying to read, depending on how much pressure a boost. Now, I'll tell you very bluntly, I typically on a street car don't run any more than about 15 pounds of boost. You just really, for me anyway, it's anything beyond that becomes unusable. Traction sucks. You can use a traction control type device. Like I use Fast for everything that I tune outside of a factory ECU. Anything more than 15 pounds of boost, you really don't. But I use a 2-bar map sensor because of that, because I'm over that 14.7 to 1. I need to be able to read a little bit more and go up into that 29 pounds of pressure that a 2-bar map sensor will read. But all of these definitions, all of these sensors, These are all the things that we're going to talk about as we get down into the road when we start talking about fuel tables, spark tables, how to set all these up initially, where the power band is in a tuning setup, and how to get there and how to adjust it to flow and to get the right fuel curve and the right spark curve to give you the right amount of power where you're trying to deliver it at. So all of these definitions, I know we kind of went through them kind of quickly. These are ones you need to commit to memory and really understand how they all work together. If you do, like I said, when we talk about the tuning side, things get a lot easier. So please don't hesitate if you've got any questions. This is the basis of everything we're going to do down the road. Please leave a comment down below. Leave a question down below. I'll be happy to answer every question that I get. I try to do that on every video I do. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate. Leave them down below. Hey, for sure, like the video if you thought it was cool, you got something out of it. And subscribe if you already haven't, and hit the notification bell and all that other monkey business. So anyway, I'm looking forward to this series. I think it's going to be really good, but I know this is going to be a long video, but really laying the foundations where we got to start at. So I appreciate y'all watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. Thanks.